The virtual rainbow brings together LGBTQ plus youth and their families, community leaders, professionals, and healthcare providers to learn and celebrate diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome. Welcome, everyone, and it's my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Jeff Myers. I've known Jeff for quite a few years. He was the president of an organization called Epsilon Sigma Phi and has been a great mentor to me and I know to many of our colleagues in the land grant system. Um, Jeff um, Jeff retired as an area director for University of Maryland Extension and worked for Penn State Extension and owned and operated Delmar Farm, the family registered Holstein operation. Jeff has served in national leadership roles in Extension and in the dairy industry. He's going to tell you more about that background. Additionally, Jeff serves as a life, career, and executive coach. Jeff, we are so thrilled and lucky, fortunate to have you as our keynote speaker, and so looking forward to your presentation. So I'm going to bring up your slides. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Privileged to be here and be part of the Rainbow of the Rocky Summit. And I want to thank you personally, not just for this opportunity, but you have been a long-term ally and have a lot of passion for this topic as an ally, as I'm sure many of those who are out there in our audience are as well. And it's one thing to be passionate about this because it affects your own life, but it's certainly another one to be going ahead and be doing that work based on the fact of what you see as being right and having really nothing personal to gain from that. So thank you very much. I'll start with just sort of the title of my topic and just sort of put that right out there of why I care. And one of the things that is very clear to me is I care deeply about the rural community that I spent my life in. And in that rural community, there were extraordinary people, wonderful, giving people who I deeply value and deeply respect. And yet at the same time, I recognize based on my own journey that they had less exposure and still to this day have less exposure to LGBTQ individuals and maybe just not sort of the breadth of being able to interact or deal or be comfortable. And so that's certainly one of the reasons why I care. Secondly, as I always do when I've done presentations and worked in the LGBTQ community, I care about our youth. I care about those who may be in the throes of dealing with this, of knowing that they have a journey in front of them and at some point in time that they are going to deal with this. There is a period of great loneliness that almost anybody who goes through this journey deals with, a time of fear, of confusion. It's very highly connected to those issues that we each recognize that our young people, whether it's the issues surrounding LGBTQ youth and alcoholism or drug abuse or suicide rates, those rates are higher, and it's because of that loneliness. It's because of that time period of not knowing how they will possibly come through that. And then lastly, I think we each deserve, and this is the life coach in me, that we each deserve our best life. And that means being loved and supported for who we are. And with that, we'll move to the first slide, which is the child in each of us, and which is up on your screen. And I've used this in all of my trainings, and it comes at many different angles that this serves a purpose. It originally came out of the leadership training program that I did at Penn State when I worked there in Extension. But it also came from a very personal experience. And I remembered at my grandmother's funeral, and my grandfather would have been about 84 at the time. And I remembered seeing him and looking at him as he viewed into the casket at her before they closed the casket. And I saw somebody who looked like a 7 or 8 year old boy. and it was my 84-year-old grandfather. And I had never seen that. And so it was something to which sort of deeply ingrained in me that we all have a child inside of us. In this picture, you have me at age 9, and I am holding my very first 4-H project camp, Haru Emperor Brenda. And I know that name, and for any of you who come from extension backgrounds and have worked with the 4-H program, I went into fitting and showing, and I needed to know the registered name of the animal, and it has never left me to this day. But this 9-year-old boy still is very, very deep inside of me. Some of his vulnerabilities have moved and matured and sort of dissipated, but they're still there, the history and the memory of what's gone before. So he is still there deep inside of me. My reasons for using this slide have expanded over time. And at the very beginning, the one thing which I loved about doing this and was very important is that if I was speaking in front of an audience that may not be comfortable with the topic of LGBTQ, looking at that 9-year-old boy was very safe and was very comfortable and created people who in an audience might be more open as opposed to the adult who was speaking in front of the room. And I think that really translates into any diversity topic that we have the ability to do that. And so that's really always been the first and foremost reason why I use this. And that may not be necessary in this group because I know I'm speaking to the choir in most ways when we talk about the topic. Secondly, it's the fact that there is a child inside each and every one of us. And it's really important to remember that because that child, no matter which side you're coming on when you're talking with somebody, if you're having a difficult conversation, if you're seeing the world very differently, I think we are much more likely to be open and to listen, to hear someone's story if we perceive the fact that that's the child that's in front of us. And then last is the fact that from a tenet of a vein of life coaching, one thing which certain life coaches will work, and one of the sort of tools and tricks of the trade is to have you have a picture of yourself on your desk. And I've got a separate picture sitting right here on my desk in my office of yourself as a child and learning to love that child and thinking about loving that child. And I think the one real power in that is the fact that we all need to first love ourselves before we can love others. And that is so deeply relevant to all topics of diversity. So then from a LGBTQ community standpoint, this picture also speaks to sort of who I am, or at least who I was when I first came out in the community. And particularly remembering through instances through gay square dancing, where I quickly became known as Cowman, because I was still milking cows, judging cow shows, and involved in agriculture in a very strong way. And while I would have been fine with probably the alternatives of being known as the Dairy Princess or the Dairy Queen, Cowman fit my self-image a little bit more closely, and was sort of glad that was the name that stuck. I've also always pointed out when I've used this picture in the fact that if you notice, this 9-year-old me is wearing one white sock and one black sock. And when I first started doing trainings, I always made the comment, I said, well, obviously there was no fashion sense and the fashion gene hadn't kicked in at that point. And somebody from the audience was really, really early on pointed out the fact that actually by one black sock and one white sock, I matched the cap. So maybe the fashion gene had kicked in at a very, very young age. And lastly, this picture always reminds me of my friend Jim, who is from Atlanta. And Jim is a consummate Southern gentleman. And one thing which Jim always said, as he introduces me and still introduces me to anybody, is that Jeff judges cow beauty contest. And I thought if there was ever a gay male way of describing a cow show, it was certainly a cow beauty contest. So for all of those reasons, I use this slide and I put it in front of a group of people as I talk about this topic. And this topic really began for me, and I sort of began to find my voice by writing an article for the Journal of Extension. And I imagine many of you out there are from an extension background, but may not be. And if you're not, Extension is a program that connects to our land-grant universities originally doing agricultural information research and transference of that knowledge in the field across the country. And it expanded way beyond those agricultural roots, but that still is very much a part of it. But the Journal of Extension was a place that I found a voice in writing an article that was titled Interacting with Your Gay and Lesbian Colleague. And when I did that, the year it was published, I wrote it in 2007, it was published in 2008. And when we sit here in 2020, that, in my mind, at 65 years of age, is not that long ago. But the reality of it is the fact at that time, nobody had broached the subject officially in the Journal of Extension. Nobody had outed themselves in print as I did at that point in time. But the real power of doing that were two of the responses that I got from individuals at that time. One was from a colleague in the Deep South who had spent his entire year or his entire career closeted, never having told a soul. And his comments to me were the fact it just wasn't acceptable, that people in his community would have viewed him as depraved, as perverted, and as a monster. And I thought how sad that somebody has spent an entire career being somebody, or at least not being able to be who they truly were. And I had known somebody in my own life, in my own extension experience, who was on our state 4-H staff, who probably had a very similar journey. But the power of that person's email to me resonated very, very deeply. Second email that I got was from an administrative assistant who had been doing a lit review for her director and happened upon my article and had shared with me that her daughter was a lesbian and moved out of the local community because the church and the community had treated her so badly and it moved to Washington, D.C. And she, in that message to me, had told me about how difficult it was for her to hear comments that people had always made throughout her entire career. And I think that is the one thing to which, when I, particularly early on, and I think we've gotten better about it, but it's still recognizing that this topic is not just about those people who are LGBTQ, but it's about the people who are their family, it's about the friends that love them, and it's much wider and it's much bigger than simply that audience of people. Paul, I'll ask you to move to the next slide, if you would. And when we know someone's story, it changes everything. And this past fall, I had the chance to lead a lunch and learn at WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children in Washington, D.C. The lunch and learn was on storytelling. And as I asked them each to share, it was amazing the powerful stories that they started to share. And what I'll be sharing with you today will be certainly pieces of my story. But the reality of it is every single one of us has a story and an amazing story to share. And that doesn't mean we have to share that story, but it does mean it lives inside of each and every one of us. And I think the one thing which we each know is that upon learning someone's story and what backstory has happened behind them, think of the number of times that when you've learned that, it has softened your version or softened how you've seen that person. And so our stories are important. My goal here today in the time that we have is to offer you part of my story that hopefully can provide a bit of insight. My story isn't grander than any story that anybody else could tell. My story isn't indicative of any other LGBTQ individual. Though there could be similarities, the reality of it is each of us come from different families, from different communities, and live in different time periods. And so those drastically influence and change our story. But I'm hoping that in sharing my truth, that it makes you feel and it makes you think, and that it offers a very personal perspective that creates a kickoff to this summit and for the rest of the information that will get shared as we move through the rest of the summit here. And we can move on to the next slide then, Paul. In my childhood, just to give you a bit of perspective of where I came from and who I am, these pictures probably create a little bit of period for anybody who came from a 4-H background or an agricultural background. but we were a hard-working dairy farm family. We worked side by side, and we worked hard, very, very hard. Uh, we started working at the barn at least by age 6. You started by feeding calves and bringing the cows in. You got paid your whopping 25 cents a month. But as a 6-year-old, that seemed like a lot of money. We were church-going people. We were a conservative community. And we were predominantly white and very much still segregated in the areas that we lived. And in fact, I remembered within the 4-H program, uh, integration beginning to happen within that setting and affirmative action expectations that were not always met in a very positive way during that early part of my 4-H career. They were good people that were our families, that were our friends that lived in the community. And they really looked out for you and looked out all the time. Like every family that exists on this earth, we had our own unique dysfunction. But overall, we were blessed, and I was blessed with a wonderful childhood. And you can move to the next slide then, Paul. And then you sort of get past this childhood. And in this topic and in my story, it really begins as I'm a freshman at University of Maryland, because it's at that point in time that it really clicks into my consciousness of where my sexual identity lays. And my reaction for me, once that really clicks and once I'm aware of it, I am horrified. It is a violation of everything I know, certainly from my faith background that I was raised in, but also simply from a community background. And the reality of it is that here I am a freshman in college, and I would have guessed, trying to think about it, even 4 years earlier as a freshman in high school, I would not have even known what to be gay was. It would not have been on my radar. Very naive kind of a time, and certainly a family that was very overprotective. So you didn't hear about those things. So I never told a soul. And the reality of it is I never told a living soul for 10 years. And 10 years later, after working my first job in extension as a 4-H educator, I went to graduate school at Michigan State University. And as I've always told people, half of my drive was to go and to get my degree. I really wanted to get that degree. But half of my drive was to simply be far enough away from home that I could get counseling in order to change. And in that time period, I went and found a wonderful counselor, sort of lucked into it. And she was very upfront with the fact that she was fine at the end of the time period we worked together. I could decide that I was straight, that I was gay, or that I was bi. And it was an openness that I had never even considered. But in hindsight, I see it as very powerful that she said that to me. And so after a year and a half of working with her, I really reached the point of being very intent that I was determined that I was going to be straight. And after my degree, went back home to work and to manage the family dairy farm. And it was during that time frame that I actually met somebody. And that was really what it took in order for me to sort of begin a journey of loving who I was, because in caring about that person, I realized that there wasn't anything wrong with who I was, that it simply was who I was in the process. And that was very powerful for me, but it took that. It was that amount of resistance for that length of time that took that to happen. The thought of telling my family was challenging at best. And it was a friend in the dairy industry who I had met when I had gone to the World Dairy Expo who was gay. And his comment to me was the fact your family loves you and they're good people, they'll be fine. And in my gut, I didn't think that was the case. And my gut proved to be true, unfortunately. And it wasn't welcome news. And Paul, I'll give you the heads up that after I say a few more things, we'll be ready to cue the video here. But during that time period, I want to set the time period of when this happens. We are in a very different place and time than what we are today, because this is the early 1990s. And so we are in the throes of the AIDS epidemic. It is the leading cause of death for men between the ages of 25 and 44. I don't know a single living openly gay person in my home community. It just is something that does not exist on the surface. Certainly, there were people who were gay who were there, but I did not know that. There are no LGBTQ characters on TV unless it's a very obscure role, and then it is pictured and done very and highly stereotypically. And there's no discussion of gay marriage because there's more important issues. There's simply safety, health, and workplace protection that are on the table. And so that sort of gives you a different time period, I think, than today, that I go to tell my parents, and we have the discussion. And I'll let Paul play the video.
Everybody's journey is very different. My father, one day, it was the Monday after Memorial Day, parked in the driveway. I could tell by his gait as he walked into the house that he was not a happy camper. He came in and sat down in this very rocker. He proceeded to tell me what an embarrassment I was to him and my mom, what an embarrassment I was to my siblings, to my nieces, my nephews. And really the dagger that he knew cut into me was telling me that I was an embarrassment to the memory of my grandparents. He literally screamed at me, how could I be so stupid? How could I possibly be his son? Once he asked the question, are you gay? And I said, yes, I am. And when he got up from this chair, he walked out of the house, and that was a real turning point. My father came in probably every single day to the farm. And if I was outside either gardening or working in the yard or just happened to be outside, he would look straight forward, head down the lane, and never acknowledge I was alive. It was 5 years later when we finally had our second real interchange about the entire conversation. He turned to me and he said, well, as far as I'm concerned, he goes, you're nothing but a potential murderer. And then it took another 5 years before we really reached a resolution. My mom's journey was really quite different. We sat in the kitchen and we talked about it, and she cried through most of it. But instead of blaming me for any of it, she owned every bit of it. Because my mother thought and said she was a horrible mother, that God didn't like her, that she had been a bad Christian, and that was why I ended up being gay. It was very difficult to watch that almost every single day she was in a housecoat. But as opposed to my dad, who never would speak to me and certainly couldn't speak about it, my mother and I would talk on a regular basis. The fact that I was here and we were able to talk about it, I think helped her immensely on her journey. Over the years, she did begin to come around a little bit. As I sang with the gay and lesbian chorus in Baltimore, she would come to hear us sing. And I remember the first time ever watching her in that congregation. And she was so uncomfortable and in so much pain, but I was so proud. Upon being invited to my brother and his partners for a garden party, my mother had came to ask whether I might take her to there, and having offered her, my father insisted that his role as her husband would be to take her to that party. She basically forced his hand and said, well, if you're going to take me, you have to do one thing first, and that's go down and apologize to Jeff. And interestingly enough, back in that rocker in the kitchen, we sat for 45 minutes talking about my journey and his journey. Once he let that wall go, he was able to go ahead and be much more open, truly being able to be supportive in his way. And that really is what it's all about. Whether it's accepting ourselves or other people accepting who we all each are on our own journey. And it really can't be accelerated, it can't be fast-tracked. It's really about each of us in our own discovery, taking our time to find our way and allowing that person the grace and the openness to take their journey on their own. She said,
So that video gives you a flavor of my parents' reaction. And it's one of those things where it can be challenging for me to watch that now. And it's always been a challenge in doing the presentations because my mom and my dad were exceptional, wonderful people who I love dearly. And it was difficult when my dad was still alive to do the presentations and talk about it. But now that both my parents are passed, there's still a challenge to that. But at the same time, we're human and we have that frailty that is part of who we are, but it's also been a huge piece of why I have pushed and moved forward. I was lucky to be well into my 30s as we dealt with this because I had a lot of maturity and depth by which I could handle uh, their reactions to that. And Paul, you can move on to the next slide that has the parents there. Um, I knew what it took and the length of time it took me to accept myself. So I luckily, because of my age and my understanding, I knew it wasn't going to be quick with them. I can add two stories and just sort of building on what is said within that clip. Um, for my mom, I talked in the clip and just briefly mentioned that she stayed in her house coat that entire summer. She never left the house. She was that depressed. And at one time they did go that summer to on a trip to Alaska. She pulled herself together to do that, but when she came back home, she was right back into sort of very sullen state, living in the housecoat, being very, very difficult to be with and to live by. And I lived in the house next door to them. But my mom and I, all the time we talked about it, we'd always have to be without Dad in our presence because he refused to talk about it, refused to be part of that. But my mom was a talker and she needed to do that. And so it was several years later, after we had talked about it, and she was in a much better place. Certainly not totally comfortable, but in a much better place. It was actually on her birthday, which was June 4th. And we walked outside the house, and her and I are talking on the front porch. And she made the comment to me. She said, she said, that first summer after you told us, she goes, I think I was depressed. And I turned to her and I said, no shit, Sherlock. I said, you had me scared so badly, and so forth. But she really did evolve and be much more embracing, always with a little bit of hesitancy because of some values that she held dear. And the one story about Dad, and I talked about the fact after 10 years, he came back in, sat in the rocker that's in the picture up there, which was my grandparents' rocker, and had our conversation. And I explained to him, he had said some awful things to me, and they were very hateful. But I told him that on my good days, I knew he had said them out of love because he was sure he was right. And he thought that if he said those things, it would get me to change. And I said, I understood that on my good days. I said, on my bad days, you didn't fare so well. But even in his own journey, I'm very proud of how far he came. Because once again, while there was probably a little bit of hesitancy and maybe not a full embracing of it, there was somebody, my dad sort of returned after those 10 years, and his humor and his ability to be loving and supportive. And so that was very much a gift from that standpoint. Within the personal journey, I also have many family members who would be very deeply fundamentalist in their faith, very sincere, very genuine in that. Some of them have still struggled to this day and being loving to me, but still not necessarily loving that piece of me. But one thing which was amazing to me is I had the most extraordinary friends. And while I had friends who had very little openness or exposure to it, they were fully loving and supporting and certainly got me through it. And so if we can move to the next slide then, Paul. I wanted to briefly touch on my extension work and really sort of that work that I have done and some of the things which happened to me within that work setting, which I think is an important piece um, that we all need to think about. How does this overlap within that work setting? And the first boss to whom I came out to would have been Frankie Schwenk, which would have been in the late 1990s, probably 97 or 98. She was our state program leader for 4-H and family consumer science at the University of Maryland. And I asked to speak to her, and we went into the library at the Maryland 4-H Foundation. And I came out to her and explained to her I thought it was important that she know. And in her response to me, and it was very powerful because she sincerely meant it, she said, she said, this is your private life. You don't need to share this with me. I'm fine with it. But This is your own information. And I sat there for a second, being caught off guard that I wasn't quite sure where to go with it. And then it clicked in my brain, and I said, well, I said, there's two reasons why you need to know this. I understand and appreciate you think this is my private information. But at the same time, I said, there are two reasons why I am telling you. And I said, one of them is the fact that I was in charge of State Natural Resources Camp 2 weeks earlier. I do a lot of other 4-H and youth programming where I'm working with young people. I said, but I'm also singing with a gay and lesbian chorus. I'm also involved with Baltimore's Gay Pride. And I could easily be on television on the 11 o'clock news, on the 5 o'clock news, or between people talking. I said, it's easily something that could be shared. And I said, you will have some families and some parents who may be upset. And I said, it's very possible that you get a call and you need to have I need to give you the ability to have the time to prepare an answer so that you're not caught off guard. And I said, so that there are no surprises, I think I owe it to you. But I had said, more importantly, I said, we as your work family are here and we work together, we support one another. And I said, we know you have a husband, and if something were to happen to him, tragically, if he were to be killed in a car accident, I said, we as your work family would be there to support you. We would understand your grief. We would know why you were being absent. We would understand why maybe in coming back, you're not being your best self. And we would be there to love and support you. And I said, I have a partner. And I said, but if nobody knows, which at that time they did not, I said, and if something happens to him that's equally as tragic, I said, who is there then to support me, to love me, to understand my grief, to understand my absence, or even excuse my absence? And there, when I came back, to support that person who may not be functioning. And she sat and she looked at me and she said, I never thought of it. And so I think we often get the question of why do we have to talk about this? Why is this important? And that's why it's important, because there's a humanity that there are certain rights that we all deserve as people. And so I think it speaks to that. And I will always be grateful that at Frankie's retirement, she came up to me and she had expressed the fact that she had probably learned more in her experience with me than any other person that she had worked with. And I know it was probably mostly that one conversation. When I went to work for Penn State, I had a great experience in my interview process and my job offer. Michelle Rogers, who hired me there, awesome person to work for. But she called me to make my job offer to me. And I was pretty comfortable with who I was at that point. This would have been 2002. And she made the comment because she called on a Friday evening or on a Thursday evening, knowing I was going away for the weekend. And she said, before you go away, I want to make sure you have this. And in being simply cordial and conversational, she said, so where are you going this weekend? I said, well, actually, I said, I'm going to Rehoboth Beach for a square dance event. And her comment was, oh, my parents, who are retired dairy farmers from Lancaster County, she goes, they square dance all over the place. She goes, maybe they'll be there. And I turned and over the phone and I just said, well, I said, this is a gay and lesbian square dance event. So while they would be more than welcome there, and we do have straight people there, it's probably not likely that they're going to be there. And she just laughed and said, no, not really likely that we're going to have that's where they're going to be. And she said, you know that this doesn't matter. And I said, well, I didn't think that it did, but I said, it's important to me that. And so it was one of those things. I started with Penn State in 2002 in the York community. It was an area that I could commute from home. And it was interesting because it was a dairy and a Holstein community who all knew me walking into that community, who had known me my whole life. I had judged the county fair multiple times. And there were no issues with me being gay from that group. From everybody else, it could be an issue depending on circumstances. I was outed before I ever walked in the door by one person who worked there. And over time, gained a lot more support. But there were problems that existed. I remember the one person who went and she made the comment one day, I had clogs on. She said, "Why are you wearing the girly shoes?" And I just sort of looked at her and I realized that as a deeply faith-based person, she was struggling with the gay piece. And it was just her nervousness in taking something that didn't fit a masculine piece to her. And my boss had wanted to handle the situation. And I said, no, just let it ride, because I firmly believe it's just coming out of nervous energy. And by the time I left 10 years later, there's nobody who would support it more strongly than that individual. I did have an agronomy educator who, behind my back anyway, would refer to me with an expletive and the word faggot. I had that in my home farm community, but once again, those things were rare and never to my face. And yet, while that one agronomy educator did that, I had other extraordinary support from ag educators, a dairy educator from the central part of the state. When we talked about it one time, he simply said, he goes, I have no experience with this. If I ever say anything that offends you, please let me know. And I've used that as a real powerful thing when I talk about working and in the workplace and what can you say. And I think anytime we express our own naivete, our own inability to maybe say the right thing, it automatically opens the door to a very comfortable, very safe kind of relationship. I had another ag educator who served with me on a national board, who, upon congratulating him on his marriage, turned to me and just made the comment. He goes, "Well, your turn will come one day." And once again, I thought, in a very simple statement, acknowledging that he knew, not that we had ever talked about it, but certainly an extraordinarily supportive statement. When I came out to my fellow directors in the region, my boss was not in favor of me doing that, but I needed to do it. And it's something I think most people, once they're out, need to do, that people you're working closely with, you want them to know. And while I had one very conservative colleague who I thought it might be an issue with, I had another colleague who I was sort of my mentor, as I had gotten started in my first year, who would not even speak to me for 8 months after. And 7 years later, actually became my boss. And it was something that, a relationship that never got repaired. I had it used against me in administrative review with people on my staff, actually only 2 people on my staff, but saying that I was way too out, that I made them uncomfortable. While most of the gay community would tell me that I wasn't out enough and wasn't in people's face enough. And also had the disappointment of not getting a position that, by all accounts, that the homophobia that entered into that was probably the deciding factor. And so I have had those experiences in my career. And yet at the same time, I had a regional director who came up to me after the article was published. And this was a regional director from a military background, very much sort of a hardcore kind of a person that I had never clicked with, who thanked me for the article and told me that he had shared it with all his county directors. And then, upon talking to me a little bit more, it came out that his son was gay and that his wife had gotten him through that journey. And as a military person, he struggled immensely with the fact that his son was gay. And so you end up realizing that you touch people's lives. I had a board president who I sat and had lunch with, and came out to her and shared just a brief piece of my story. And she turned to me and she goes, I've never told anybody connected to our program. She was a master gardener with us. And she said, but my son is a gay man, my daughter's a lesbian, and my ex-husband is gay. And she said, it was weird once I realized that through most of the years of my marriage, I was the only straight person. And so you have people who open up to you, that if you're willing to be out there and if you're willing to put your story on the line, who will give you the chance to love and to support them. And even recently, I had an extension educator who I had served with, who called me to look for support because they were supporting, in turn, an educator who was changing genders in order to match their identity, and somebody who was going to be faced with a huge backlash based on the program area and based on the part of the country that they And so all of that story brings me to today. Upon my dad's passing, I moved to the family farm, from the family farm to Baltimore City. So I traded 141 acres of open space and two wonderful porches to an apartment that I sort of have aerial space and a view of the Baltimore City skyline. But I'm still filled with a love for that rural community that's been a part of my life. All of that is within 45 minutes to an hour's drive of where I am, and I'm still very and deeply connected to them. I always hope that in what I've shared, and this is the journey of just one gay man, that I have the chance to open hearts and minds just a little and give something for each of us to ponder and think about. I always insist with all of my audiences, and maybe not as necessary here, but certainly when I'm out in the field and talking with people, I'm not here to change what you believe, and I'm not here to interfere with your faith. And I truly mean that. The reality of it is we can't change anyone. Change that happens is their personal journey. We can offer someone something to think about, but the rest of that is their work and it's up to them. And my dad's own personal journey is certainly a testament to that. And I think that part of remembering that we're not here, we don't have the ability to change that person, to change what they think, but we can present opportunities, we can present information that hopefully moves them along. I'll close with the next slide. And if we could, Paul. And it's a slide that I've always used. And to each person out there, we have young people who are part of this, who are listening in, and you're deliberating on coming out. That coming out is a very personal decision, and you will know when that is right for you. But for me, there is nothing I ever heard that typified and gave significance to what I felt like after. And as it says here, and the day came when the risk it took to remain tight in the bud was more powerful than the risk it took. And I think for my journey, I think it blossomed. And so it's one of those things where I think that part that you really feel after that point in time of coming out, there are obstacles, it can be rough along the way, but there are just extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary heartfelt rewards that come once you've grown past that threshold. I thank you for the honor of opening the summit. I give kudos to Montana State University and its cutting edge, creative, and just passionate faculty and staff who created and pulled this together. And for those of you in the audience, I know you are dedicated to this. I know you give your passion to this, and I'm humbled to be in your presence. So thank you very much, and I'll gladly entertain any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff, for those really moving, very stirring words and very personal, sharing that very personal journey with us. I'd like to invite you all to pose any questions or comments. I will keep your names anonymous unless you'd prefer me to recognize you, but the Q&A is meant to be anonymous, and it's an opportunity where you can provide questions or comments, any kind of feedback. So please type those in. We're getting some thank yous and some hellos from Virginia Tech. So you've got a fan, Jeff, Virginia Tech checking in. And some
You can say hi to Dave. I know who that is. So, or at least I think I know who that is.
Someone else has said thank you. Always good to hear from you. So you've got some fans out there. Again, we've got a few minutes before our next presenter. And Molly in West Virginia is the one who said, thank you, Jeff. Always good to hear from you. So,
Twice.
Well, great. Let me just scroll down the Q&A box here, and I will, I'll read these off to you. Beautiful story, Jeff. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Somebody else said, thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate you sharing your story. Patrick from Montana Extension. Um, Another thank you for sharing your story. Thank you from Penn State Extension. Um, Thank you for giving this presentation, and glad to hear there's another Michigan State University alumni. Another person just saying, thanks, Jeff. Someone else saying, hi, Jeff. Let me know if you want me to identify you there. Love from Penn State, another individual. Thank you from Maine, powerful story. So we've got folks all across the United States listening in right now. So thanks for all of those wonderful comments. We do have a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask Jeff a question. Another person just said, I have a big smile on my face. Patrice Ingram.
Ah,
And another person just said, thank you for your powerful words. Another, what one word would you like youth to resonate with? What one word would you like youth to resonate with? And thank you.
one word for youth to resonate with. I don't know if I can do it, but to me, it's you're awesome. That life coach in me, I truly believe we are all given the opportunity and deserve to live our best lives. And that is no matter who we are. That's not an LGBTQ thing. That is simply something that the human spirit deserves. And I think that we don't always allow ourselves that. And so that's way more than one word. Just you're awesome if I had to, and that's getting it down to two. So, but that's as succinct as I can get.
That's great. Thanks. Again, we've got time for more questions, comments.
And Paul, you have the other slide that has my contact info.
Oh, yeah, let me bring that up here. And I see a number of additional questions have come up.
Okay.
Jeff, if you want to say a few words about
Sure.
work as a trainer, executive, career, life coach.
I put this up and, I just I know that many of you are out there, I know, and doing these presentations, and I've never done one in this venue before, so this was a little bit different. But I typically, when these are over, the power that happens is the individual question that somebody might have that they'll ask afterwards. And so that's my personal email address. It's actually my business email as well. And I just want anyone who's got a question to go ahead or an inquiry, feel free to use that to ask. And I do LGBTQ diversity training. I do work as an executive career and life coach. And those are things that I've done in this sort of semi-retirement stage that I am in life. But feel free, and just as an FYI, the picture is actually from the home farm and actually hangs here in my office as well. It's one of my favorite pictures that I've got of what we call our lower meadow with a few of the heifers out there.
Wonderful.
Anyway.
Few more questions. Lance from Michigan State University. I'm reading these again verbatim. Lance from Michigan State University Extension. Thank you for your story, Jeff. I love your story that I'm going to use to inspire my AmeriCorps member to let their inner child grow. Is it okay if I use your name or quote you?
Absolutely. And just so that everyone knows, the video that you showed, and it's in, I know that you and Deb have it listed in your resources, but it is available for anybody to use. I'm perfectly fine with that. There are two other videos that represent excerpts of presentation that are also there as well. If they fit into something where you're doing a training and it works, they're free for anybody to use. So please help yourselves.
Wonderful. Another comment, thank you from a Michigan State Extension employee who is out as non-binary / LGBTQ within Extension and with some of the youth I work with. It's empowering to hear your message and encouragement to stay the course, even when it's stressed. Name okay, and that's Anna Eldon Brady.
Great.
Thanks, Anna. The next comment question, Jeff, you do such a wonderful job exclamation point. You always do the best of making this topic one that everyone can feel comfortable discussing and prompting great openness. I'm so proud to have you as an extension colleague. Um, I won't read that name. It wasn't listed in the question. So thank you for that. The next comment, thank you so much for your words. I live in a Native community with youth who identify as LGBTQ plus and or two-spirited. I appreciated hearing your story of hope for those that are struggling and your for those that are struggling and your validation for being who they are. Brenda, MSU Extension. Some familiar folks there, I'm assuming, Jeff.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Um, oh, this is Chad Proudfoot. You're welcome to tell him it was from me. So that was the previous comment. Um, that you're doing such a wonderful job. Thanks, Chad. Another comment, I wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. My 26-year-old son is gay, and he was luckily accepted in high school, though it wasn't easy. So thank you for that comment. Jeff, we have just a couple of minutes left. I'll encourage our attendees to type in their questions. Is there anything else you want to say about what are your plans for the future? You've obviously you're staying busy as a diversity trainer and life coach. What else is on your list of things to do?
Well, I have learned over the last several weeks to love the inside of my apartment more than I ever cared to. I'll start there. One thing which I'll add, and I couldn't quite incorporate it in the presentation the way I wanted to, although I think it hits at it at many angles. And that is, and I know that you've seen the article, I did an article a year ago about what value did I bring to my rural community because I stayed there. Because often we think within the settings of rural communities, I think we're often very conscious of the fact that we need to accept people, we need to be inclusive, but we don't often ask the question, what value do we get from diversity by living side by side in the same community? And I guess I'm very aware of that as a gay man because most gay men in my age group moved to an urban area and left their rural community. And there's a Cultivating Change group that does a great programmatic pieces for LGBTQ folks in agriculture. And I think we're seeing this groundswell of people feeling like they don't need to leave that home community if their passion is agriculture. But I think one thing which I'm very passionate about is making sure we keep that message out there that yes, we need to be inclusive. Yes, we need to be accepting. But how much are we better as a community? How many gifts do people bring to the table because of their diversity? And LGBTQ is just one form of diversity, but I think those of us who work in a diverse environment, and I've had some environments that were more diverse than others, and I miss that diversity when I don't have it. But because of all our differences are usually connected to different gifts that we have, different viewpoints, different ways of looking at the world. And so I think it's something, and there's a lot of merit to looking at how can we go ahead and become more empowered as a community, how can we become a better community, a more evolved community, a community that listens to one another because we don't live with people who all look, sound like us and believe all the same things. Our differences are strength. And I just think there's a power to that. And it's, I think, the next stage sort of evolving from a diversity standpoint beyond simply being inclusive.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, maybe those are wonderful words to leave us with. I want to again thank you, heartfelt thank you for kicking off our summit, our Rainbows Over the Rockies summit. Jeff, we couldn't have picked a better person to open the summit. Thank you so much. And I hope you'll continue to join us throughout the summit.
I will be joining you. And I just realized that by putting my last slide up, it's somewhat rainbow light. So That really wasn't intentional, although I guess it should have been. Subconsciously, it must have been going on. That's all I know. So,
Wonderful.
but
Two more comments that just came up. Are these sessions being recorded? The answer is yes. Most of the sessions, some presenters said that they prefer not to record, but we are recording and we'll be posting these on the Rainbow's website. So you can watch this or share this with colleagues and friends. Another comment, this is Dave's colleague, Donna at Vermont at VT. We appreciated that Jeff visited with our Students for Cultivating Change group when he was VT is Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech.
That Jeff visited with our Students for Cultivating Change group when he was recently on campus. It was so valuable to have him share his story with our College of Ag and Natural Resource students. And another person just said, wonderful beginning. So Jeff, again, a heartfelt thank you for these wonderful words and sharing your story. And again, I hope you'll stay with us throughout the summit.
I will. You're most welcome, and it's been my honor.